He killed his own son, he decapitated princes, he crushed the church beneath his boots. Peter the Great modernized Russia, but through torture, fear and blood. He didn't just break the old order, he burned it alive. This is not a tale of greatness. It's a story of a man who built an empire from corpses and left no one alive to love him. He's remembered in textbooks as the visionary who modernized Russia, the towering figure who dragged a backward empire into the light of Europe. He's called Peter the Great, but behind the marble statues and bronze horsemen, another image bleeds through, a man who ruled not by law but by fear, a man who didn't just execute his enemies, he executed his own blood. In 1718, a boy screamed inside the walls of the Peter and Paul fortress. His body was broken, flayed by interrogators. His name was Alexei. He was the Tsarevich, the heir to the throne, and the orders had come from only one place, his own father, Peter. That scream, historians say, was the sound of old Russia dying. Peter IV of Russia, crowned Tsar at the age of 10, would go on to reshape his country into a modern, militarized Western-style empire. But to him, modernization was not a project. It was a war against superstition, against tradition, against the Orthodox clergy, against boyars who wouldn't shave their beards, against his own family. He crushed the Streltsy guards, men who once protected the crown, by hanging them in rows across the city walls. He forced noblemen to wear foreign clothes, speak foreign languages, and drink foreign wine. He demanded taxes on facial hair. He created a new city from nothing in a frozen swamp at the cost of thousands of peasant lives. And when his own son disagreed with him, when Alexei clung to the old ways, Peter had him tortured until he died. This is not a fairy tale of a flawed hero. This is a slow-motion execution of a nation's soul. Because Peter didn't just kill people. He killed symbols. He severed the country from its own past, replacing faith with force, icons with cannons, fathers with tyrants. And in doing so, he created a Russia that looked stronger on the outside, while bleeding quietly from within. You will hear stories of his travels through Europe, of his fascination with ships and science. But behind every reform there was a whip, behind every law, a corpse, behind every cathedral dome he tore down there were bones in the foundation. This is not about whether Peter made Russia powerful, it is about the cost and the silence of churches stripped of their bells, the silence of mothers burying their sons in frozen earth, the silence of a boy prince once full of promise, beaten until his voice could no longer rise against his father. We will follow that silence, through palaces, prisons and execution squares, through the blood-stained snow of Moscow, through the hollow corridors of St. Petersburg, and into the tomb of a man they called the Great, but who died with no heir, no love, and no legacy, untouched by blood. He killed the old Russia and his own son with equal resolve. Historian Evgeny Anisimov. Peter's crimes were not committed in rage. They were carried out with cold, calculated purpose. Every death was a step forward in his vision. Every body buried beneath St. Petersburg's stone was a brick in his monument. But in the end, even Peter couldn't escape the curse he created, because when you kill your past, your future forgets you too. This is the story of Tsar Peter the Great, not the legend, not the statue, the man behind the crimes. Before he became the architect of an empire, Peter was a child standing in the shadows of murder. He was born in 1672, the 14th child of Tsar Alexis and his second wife Natalia Narishkina. But Russia at that time wasn't a country, it was a battlefield dressed in velvet. The palace was a nest of whispers, knives behind icons, and royal children raised not with lullabies, but with fear. Peter's father died when he was just 4, and that simple event, one death, fractured the entire kingdom. The throne became a war zone between two powerful families, the Narishkins, Peter's mother's clan, and the Miloslavskis, the relatives of his older half-brother Ivan. The air itself thickened with suspicion. The boy Peter saw everything. He saw the Streltsy rebellion, a brutal uprising of palace guards loyal to the Miloslavskis. He watched as the soldiers stormed the Kremlin, searching for traitors, dragging his mother's relatives from behind doors and murdering them in front of his eyes. It is said that Peter, just 10 years old, hid behind a curtain while blood soaked the floors. They slit his uncle's throat on the palace staircase. From that moment on, something inside Peter split. Not broken, but rewired. The innocence did not disappear. It adapted. It became a mask. He was crowned Tsar at age 10, but he held no power. The real ruler was his sister Sophia, who ruled as regent. Peter was pushed aside, raised more like a hostage prince than a sovereign. He spent his youth in the village of Preobrazhenskoe, far from the court, surrounded by a strange makeshift army of children, noble boys trained in mock warfare. It started as a game, but Peter took it seriously. He built wooden fortresses, launched fake battles, forced boys his age into rigid military drills. It was in these pretend wars that he learned real control. His childhood became a dress rehearsal for authoritarianism, and unlike other royals, Peter became obsessed with knowledge. Not theology, but mechanics. He would roam shipyards, he learned blacksmithing, dentistry, carpentry. He cut teeth and hammered nails with his own hands. He wanted not only to rule his country, but to remake it piece by piece with the violence of a craftsman. But the boy who studied ships also studied people. He watched how they bowed, how they lied, how they feared. He learned that loyalty could be bought, that tradition could be mocked, and that power didn't need to wear a crown, it only needed to carry a whip. As he grew, so did his size. By age 17, Peter stood over 6'7", an enormous presence in a land of short men and shorter tempers. But he was not majestic. His hands trembled with tics. His mouth twisted uncontrollably. Some say it was from childhood trauma. Others believe it was neurological. But even this he turned into a weapon, reminding people that his rage might erupt at any moment. Behind his eyes there was Tsar. But in public he laughed loudly, partied wildly, pretended to be simple. He formed a jolly company of drunkards and fools who held mock parades and fake church councils, satirizing the very institutions he would one day crush for real. He used humour the way others use swords. He drank, he mocked, he waited. And when his half-brother Ivan died in 1696, Peter took the throne alone. At 24 years old, he was no longer the boy hiding behind curtains. He was the man behind the curtain. And no one, not the boyars, not the church, not even his own family, was safe from the empire he was about to build. The mask was still there, but now it smiled with teeth. Peter became sole ruler of Russia in 1696. He did not ascend, he seized. His half-brother Ivan, the sickly and passive court Tsar, finally died. And with his last breath, the last obstacle to Peter's full power vanished. The boy who had once trembled behind palace curtains now stood at the helm of the largest country on earth. But he did not rule from a throne. He ruled from a forge, a shipyard, a battlefield, and a bottle. Peter's vision of Russia was not one of continuity, it was demolition. He saw his homeland as broken, backward, crippled by tradition, superstition, and medieval stagnation, and to him the Orthodox clergy were parasites, the boyar nobility, leeches, the peasantry, raw material to be shaped or sacrificed. Only through fire could Russia be reborn, and Peter brought fire. In 1697, he left Russia disguised as a commoner on a 250-man diplomatic mission across Europe. It was called the Grand Embassy, but Peter didn't act like a czar. He worked as a shipbuilder in Dutch yards, learned anatomy in English hospitals, studied artillery with Prussian generals. He cut through Europe like a student with a whip, absorbing everything except mercy. But as he travelled back home, his enemies stirred. The Streltsy, the elite military corps who had once murdered Peter's family members during the rebellion of his childhood, rose again. While Peter was away, they mutinied, hoping to place his half-sister Sophia back on the throne. But they underestimated what kind of man Peter had become. He returned to Russia with no forgiveness in his bags. Over 1,000 Streltsy were rounded up, tortured, mutilated, and publicly executed. Peter personally swung the axe for several beheadings, blood soaking his sleeves as onlookers watched in horror. Heads were nailed to poles, bodies hung in rows across Moscow's walls. It was not justice, it was theatre, a warning to the entire country. The Tsar no longer played pretend. And from that point forward, Peter launched a campaign of modernization so brutal it bled the soul from Russia. He ordered all men to shave their beards, to wear Western suits, to abandon their ancestral robes. Those who refused paid heavy taxes, or were forcibly shaved by Peter's own hands. A symbolic stripping of identity. Russia's old face was cut off with a razor. Nobles were compelled to dance in court balls, speak French or German, and let women attend public events. The church was censed, its authority decapitated as Peter placed it under state control. Monasteries were looted. Clergy were forbidden from preaching political sermons. He did not reform faith. He buried it. In 1703, Peter found his blank canvas, a swamp on the edge of the Gulf of Finland. There he ordered the construction of a city unlike anything Russia had ever seen, a city of stone, canals, and European grandeur. He named it St. Petersburg after St. Peter, but also unmistakably after himself. And he didn't wait for approval. He took it from the bodies of the poor. Tens of thousands of serfs, prisoners, and conscripted labourers were dragged into the marshes. Malaria, hunger, frost, exhaustion. The mud was too deep for horses, so men carried stone on their backs. The death toll is still debated. Some say 25,000 died. Others claim over 100,000. The foundations of St. Petersburg were not laid in mortar. They were packed with bones. But Peter saw only progress. He forced noble families to relocate there, ordered European architects to design it, moved government functions to its freezing halls. Even as corpses froze in the canals, Peter called it his window to the west. Through that window, Russia would leap forward, whether it wanted to or not. He drank, he danced, he passed laws faster than anyone could read them. His court became a whirlwind of chaos and control, and behind his laughter there were screams. The Tsar had risen, but with him rose a silence across the land, a silence born not of peace, but of fear. In his eyes, Russia was a patient, and he was the surgeon with no anesthesia. The blade that Peter used to slice away the old Russia did not stay at a distance. It turned inward, toward his friends, his blood, his son. By the early 1700s, the mask had started to crack. The laughter of the jolly company grew colder. The wine soured, and those closest to the Tsar began to vanish, one by one. It started with Fyodor Romodanovsky, Peter's trusted childhood comrade and head of the feared Preobrazhensky Prikaz, the internal security force. Once Peter had called him His Majesty the Prince Caesar as a joke. Now he barely summoned him at all. Fyodor died in 1717, under mysterious circumstances. His files were seized, his name faded. Peter had no use for friends who remembered who he used to be. Then came the church. Peter's war against tradition sharpened into something more brutal, a war against belief itself. The death of Patriarch Adrian in 1700 marked a turning point. Instead of allowing a new spiritual leader to take his place, Peter left the seat empty. For 21 years. No more divine balance, no more holy intercession. The Tsar now ruled both body and soul. Priests were forbidden from hearing confessions about treason. Those who did were to report directly to the state. Sermons were censored. Monasteries taxed into ruin. Religious schools replaced with military academies. The bells of the church did not ring for the Tsar, so he melted them into cannons. Peter didn't destroy institutions overnight. He drained them, silenced them, turned them into mirrors that only reflected himself. But nothing revealed his transformation more than how he treated his own son. Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich was not like his father. Where Peter was loud and explosive, Alexei was quiet and reserved. Where Peter travelled the world, Alexei clung to home. He was deeply religious, attached to the old ways, and surrounded himself with conservative clergy and courtiers who longed for a Russia before the axe. Peter saw this not as difference, but as defiance. The divide between father and son grew like a rot under marble. Peter saw Alexei as a threat to everything he had built. He accused his own son of laziness, cowardice, and treason. In private, he screamed at him. In public, he humiliated him. In letters, he gave him an ultimatum: reform or renounce the throne. Terrified, Alexei did the unthinkable. He fled. Disguised as a peasant, he escaped to Vienna under protection of the Holy Roman Emperor. For Peter, this wasn't just betrayal, it was blasphemy. A son running to the arms of the West, not to build, but to undo his father's empire. Peter demanded his return, and through diplomatic pressure, threats and manipulation, he got it. Alexei came back, and he begged for mercy. He wouldn't get it. Peter orchestrated a state trial of his own child. He claimed Alexei had plotted with foreign powers to seize the throne. He dragged confessions out of everyone near him, the church, the nobility. Even Alexei's mistress, Afrosinia, was forced to testify. Peter then ordered torture. Alexei was beaten, stretched, torn. He was subjected to the same interrogations reserved for political enemies, on Peter's personal command. For months, the heir to the Russian throne was reduced to a pile of bruises, broken bones, and whispered apologies. He confessed to crimes he never committed, because pain has no conscience. On June 26, 1718, after a final brutal round of torture, Alexei died in his cell. Officially, it was called apoplexy, but no one was fooled. Peter killed his son, not with a blade, but with permission. The empire held its breath. There was no funeral procession, no mourning, just silence. Peter didn't weep, he erased. This was no longer the Tsar who wanted to modernize his country. This was a man who would destroy anything, including his own legacy, to make sure the future bore only his image. The death of Alexei should have haunted Peter, but it didn't. If anything, it emboldened him. He had destroyed his own blood to secure his reforms. Now there were no more restraints, no voices left to plead tradition, no heir to threaten his vision. What followed was not modernization, it was acceleration by brutality. Peter had always believed that suffering could shape a stronger Russia. Now he applied that belief with mathematical cruelty. His new capital, St. Petersburg, had already begun to rise out of the swampy wastelands by the Gulf of Finland. But what had started as a symbol of hope became a monument of horror. The land was uninhabitable. Disease festered in the water. The ground froze in winter and melted into sludge by spring. There were no roads, no stone, no housing. But Peter didn't care. He demanded that the city be built, not slowly, not safely, but immediately. He conscripted tens of thousands of labourers, peasants, soldiers, prisoners of war and common criminals. Many were sent without tools, food or clothing. They died by the thousands, and the numbers are still disputed to this day. Some say 25,000 perished. Other estimates rise to 100,000. There were no coffins. The bodies were buried in the foundations. The city's first stones were cemented with blood. And yet Peter called it progress. He taxed the nobility to fund it. He forced entire aristocratic families to relocate to his city of ice. Those who refused were exiled or financially ruined. Men died of frostbite while building imperial palaces they would never step inside. Families were torn from Moscow and dragged into the mist. In the streets, starvation took hold. During the coldest winters, dogs and children froze to death beside the Neva River, while nobles danced in newly built ballrooms. St. Petersburg was not a city. It was a warning. But it was not just stone and frost that bore Peter's wrath. His hatred turned to the very flesh of Russia, its people. To reshape society in his image, Peter ordered a complete transformation of public appearance and private identity. Traditional long beards were taxed, heavily. Those who refused to pay had their beards forcibly shaved by state officials, often in public squares, as crowds watched and jeered. To Peter, a beard symbolized the old Russia he wished to kill, and so he shaved it off one face at a time. The boyars, the noble class, were stripped of their ancestral rights. Their rank would no longer be inherited. It had to be earned through service to the state, often most military or administrative. If they failed, they lost everything. The message was clear. Power did not come from blood anymore. It came from Peter. Women, once secluded and veiled, were now forced to appear at social functions, to dance, to dress in foreign styles. The Tsar was rewriting gender, family, identity, and no one was allowed to say no. Those who resisted were punished. Publicly, punishments ranged from beatings and imprisonment to mutilation. People were hanged for mocking the reforms, priests were tortured for refusing to comply, entire villages were burned for defiance, and through all of it Peter laughed. He laughed as he forced his courtiers to drink until they collapsed. He staged mock ceremonies where he crowned drunkards as patriarchs of drunkenness, mocking the church he had dismembered. Even cruelty became a carnival. He once nailed a man's tongue to a post for speaking out of turn. He reportedly watched another noble be slowly flayed alive, noting how long he survived. These acts were not strategy, they were performance. The empire was not just being reformed, it was being reprogrammed. Peter was not building a new Russia. He was unmaking the old one, limb by limb, ritual by ritual, until nothing was left but the sound of boots and broken prayers. In the West, ambassadors praised him. In Russia, people whispered of him not as a man but as a storm, one they could not stop, one they could not escape. By the 1720s, Peter was no longer a reformer. He was a monarch in full control of law, of land, of breath. He had broken the church, silenced the nobility, and buried his own heir. Now he began to act like something more than a Tsar. He acted like a god. And in his empire, obedience was the new gospel. He had no patience for opposition, not even from the dead. He ordered the corpses of political enemies exhumed and posthumously punished, graves desecrated, names stricken from documents, whole bloodlines erased. If memory itself refused to bend to him, he crushed it. Peter didn't trust tradition, he trusted fear. One of his most chilling inventions was the table of ranks, a rigid bureaucratic ladder that dictated a man's status not by birth, but by service to the state. To climb it, one had to surrender completely to Peter's machine. Even the noblest families were forced to claw for relevance, obeying every command just to survive, and yet survival wasn't guaranteed, because Peter had started turning on those closest to him. Andriy Osterman, once a loyal statesman, Alexander Menshikov, Peter's closest confidant and companion from childhood. They were elevated, used and discarded, like worn tools. Menshikov in particular had shared Peter's table for decades, but when the Tsar sensed growing ambition or disloyalty, even a lifetime of loyalty could not protect. Menshikov would later be arrested and exiled after Peter's death, but even in life, Peter kept his so-called friends walking a tightrope over fire, and then came the bishops. With the Orthodox Church gutted and its patriarchal seat still vacant, Peter created a Holy Synod, a committee of state-controlled clergymen who would replace the spiritual leadership with political obedience. No longer would the Church be the soul of the nation. It was now its muzzled mouthpiece. Priests were forced to spy on their congregations. Confession became surveillance. Monasteries that refused to comply were seized or destroyed. Peter had not only disarmed the Church, he had turned it into a puppet, hung by the strings of bureaucracy. Even God in Peter's Russia wore a uniform. And in this new empire of silence, even death was redesigned. Peter personally reformed burial rites. He banned the traditional Orthodox practice of monks reading psalms at graves. Funerals were secularized. Tombstones bore state-approved inscriptions. Mourning was shortened. To die in Russia no longer meant to pass into eternity. It meant being filed. But perhaps the most grotesque symbol of Peter's transformation into tyrant was the Kunstkamera, his museum of curiosities. Inside its halls were hundreds of human fetuses preserved in jars, malformed animals, dissected organs, and anatomical horrors. Peter had collected them obsessively, parading them as examples of scientific advancement. He demanded that malformed babies born across the empire be sent to him for display. They were labelled, numbered, pickled, proof, he said, that Russia must overcome ignorance. But what the people saw was different. They saw a king who bottled deformities and called it enlightenment. They saw a man who punished nature itself for disobedience. The Kunstkamera became a metaphor for his rule, cold, controlling, grotesquely rational, where humanity was reduced to specimens. And still Peter kept working. His days were spent writing laws, inspecting dockyards, reviewing troops. His nights drowned in alcohol and excess. He had no heir, no clear successor, and no mercy left. He passed edicts about marriage, childbirth, and clothing. Even how a citizen laughed could be policed. The Tsar had remade Russia in his image, and his image was terrifying. But there was one thing he couldn't control: his body. Peter had long suffered from urinary tract problems, fevers, kidney stones, seizure-like convulsions. His towering frame began to bend, his hands shook more violently, his vision blurred. And in the winter of 1724, he dove into icy waters to save stranded soldiers. He succeeded, but the infection that followed would not spare him. Even a man who believed himself to be above all others could not escape rot. The god had conquered his kingdom, but death had been watching quietly and waiting. Peter's empire looked indestructible from the outside. Disciplined armies, glittering palaces, a new capital carved from swamp. But under the marble and frost it was crumbling, because Peter had jinxed the country, not healed it. The peasants, the clergy, the old nobility, they obeyed, but only out of fear. His laws had rewritten their lives, but not their loyalties, and fear, like ice, eventually cracks under weight. Even before his death, the resistance had already begun to whisper. In southern Russia, Cossack bands grumbled against the taxes, the beard laws, the foreign clothes they were forced to wear. In Siberia, Orthodox monks who refused Peter's reforms preached secretly by candlelight, their icons hidden under floorboards. And in the corridors of the Kremlin, boyars, Those once proud nobles, reduced to bureaucrats, spoke in riddles, careful not to name the enemy they all feared. But the deepest wound was the one Peter inflicted on his own dynasty. With Alexei dead and no other son old enough or legitimate enough to inherit the throne, Peter had destroyed the very principle of succession he was meant to preserve. In 1722, he passed a chilling decree. From now on, the Russian Tsar would choose his successor not by blood but by will. It was a law forged out of paranoia. Peter feared a return to the old world he had shattered, so he ensured that no bloodline, not even his own, could automatically claim the future. But in doing so, he created a dangerous vacuum, because Peter never signed the document naming his heir. In the final years of his life, he grew increasingly erratic. He roamed St. Petersburg at night in disguise. He interrogated soldiers in their barracks. He ordered the beating of an entire guard unit for misstepping during parade. Some say he spoke to shadows, others say he feared them. Even his loyal court began to falter. Menshikov, the man who had survived everything, grew uneasy. He tried to consolidate power through Peter's second wife Catherine, who had given Peter 2 daughters but no legitimate male heir. Peter's courtiers split into factions. Some backed Catherine, others longed for a forgotten son or a distant Romanov cousin. The empire Peter had centralized around himself now spun in confusion, with no center at all. And the people? They simply waited. Because the empire no longer belonged to them, it belonged to the storm. In 1724, just 1 year before his death, Peter staged a twisted ceremony. He crowned Catherine as empress, not as consort but as co-ruler. It was a desperate move. Peter knew death was close. His urinary infection had worsened, causing unimaginable pain. He could barely stand, let alone rule. His once godlike presence shriveled into a groaning, fevered figure, surrounded by physicians who could do nothing. And yet even now he would not surrender control. In January 1725, he tried to write his final decree. The pen trembled. He wrote 4 words, "Leave all to," and then his hand stopped. He fell unconscious and never awoke again. The man who had ruled everything, armies, cities, bodies, even souls, died with his last sentence unfinished. When the news of his death reached the people, there was no mourning, no national wail, no spontaneous outpouring of grief. There was confusion, silence, fear. Because no one knew who was Tsar. Peter had killed his heir, destroyed the line of succession, and drowned Russia's old rituals in foreign dress. Now the throne sat empty, and no one knew whether to pray, to cheer, or to run. Within hours, Menshikov and the guards declared Catherine the empress, using Peter's coronation from the year before as a legal loophole. She was crowned, but she was no Peter. She would rule only 2 years before dying of illness. After her, chaos reigned. Cousins, infants, nobles, and generals would fight over the throne for decades. Peter had reshaped Russia's future, but without a blueprint. He had burned the map and left the country in a labyrinth of mirrors. His empire, though tall and gilded, now stood on unstable soil, because power without love is a flame without fuel, and Peter had lit too many fires. When Peter died in 1725, Russia did not weep. It held its breath. For decades he had held the empire together by sheer force of will, of law, of fear. But now the man who had controlled even how his people dressed and prayed was gone, and he had left no one to replace him. His final words, "Leave all to Thorn," trailed off into death. No name, no signature, just silence. And in that silence the cracks widened. The throne of Russia, once passed from father to son guided by blood and tradition, now became a prize to be claimed. The law Peter himself had written, granting the Tsar the right to appoint any successor, had turned to ash in his fingers, because he had used it on no one. It was the beginning of what historians would later call the time of palace coup. The guards who had once enforced Peter's every command now became the kingmakers. The imperial guard, loyal not to a bloodline but to the highest bidder, seized the moment. Within days of Peter's death, they threw their weight behind Catherine I, his second wife, an illiterate former laundress from Lithuania whom Peter had elevated to empress. Catherine ruled in name, but not in power. Real control shifted to Alexander Menshikov, Peter's old comrade. He pulled strings behind the curtain, placing allies in key posts, silencing dissent, and attempting to continue the machinery Peter had built. But without Peter's presence, it sputtered. Catherine reigned only 2 years, Then she too died. And the throne fell to a child, Peter II, Peter the Great's grandson, through the murdered Alexei. Irony twisted like a knife. The very blood Peter tried to erase now sat on his throne, but the boy was just 11, and he would die of smallpox at 14, leaving the crown to float at gain without anchor. For the next 30 years, Russia descended into a carousel of rulers. Anna Ivanovna, Ivan VI, an infant imprisoned for life, Elizabeth, Peter's daughter, and eventually Catherine the Great, who would rise not by inheritance but by military coup. Peter had designed a future without predictability, without family, without permanence, and that future devoured itself. The reforms he forced, taxes, military service, shaved beards, European customs, began to unravel in places he never imagined. Rural Russia remained deeply orthodox. Peasants clung to old beliefs. The nobles, stripped of identity, grew resentful and cold. Without Peter's grip, the state began to rot from within, and yet the monuments still stood. St. Petersburg, his cold marble city of death, remained the capital. Foreign ambassadors still came. Cannons still lined the Neva. His image was preserved in paintings, coins, and statues. But beneath the surface, the rot spread. Because Peter had built everything around himself, his hand signed every edict. His voice commanded every change. When that voice fell silent, there were no echoes, only imitators. Some tried to continue his path. Others tried to reverse it, but none could match his force, because what Peter created was not a system, it was a cult of command, and like all cults, once the leader died, the faith unraveled. Historians today still debate Peter's legacy. Some call him a genius, a visionary, the man who made Russia strong enough to survive the next 3 centuries of war and empire. Others call him a tyrant, a butcher in velvet robes, a man who killed his son to save his pride and left a kingdom gasping for guidance. Both views are true. That is Peter's curse. He was both builder and destroyer. He opened Russia to the west and closed its heart to itself. He modernized a nation and left it fatherless. And the final proof of his failure? No one could mourn him. There was no national day of grief, no procession of wailing citizens, no cathedral bells ringing for the man who had killed the church. The throne he left behind was made of ice, grand but always melting. And in the years to come, others would sit on it, not with reverence but with suspicion, always wondering when the ghost of Peter would return, demanding obedience from beyond it. Grave. The man who once commanded the lives of millions did not vanish. He was reshaped. When Peter died, the empire he had crafted did not collapse, but neither did it remember him honestly. Instead, it forgave him selectively, carving his legacy with cold precision, just like he had carved Russia itself. The truth was too dangerous to preserve. You cannot build a saint from a man who tortured his own son, so they built a statue instead. In 1782, more than half a century after his death, Catherine the Great, another ruler by coup, not by blood, commissioned the most iconic image of Peter, the bronze horseman. Towering, majestic, triumphant, Peter is cast atop a rearing steed, pointing westward toward Europe, the direction of his reforms. The base is a massive thunder-shaped rock said to have taken hundreds of men months to transport. Inscribed simply, "To Peter I from Catherine II." There is no mention of Alexei, no mention of the torture chambers, no blood, no bones, just bronze. But statues do not remember. People do, and among the people Peter's memory split. In the cities, especially St. Petersburg, the city of the Tsars, he became mythic, the father of the navy, the reformer, the visionary who gave Russia its modern bones. His museums, palaces, and docks became symbols of order and power. But in the countryside, his name brought only silence. In Orthodox villages, Peter was the man who mocked the church, shaved holy men with his own hands, turned sacred relics into state curiosities. His legacy was an open wound, passed down through whispers, sermons said in secret, and folk tales full of veiled warnings. To many devout Russians, Peter wasn't a saviour. He was an antichrist in imperial robes. And among the nobility, memory was cautious. They remembered the table of ranks, the endless demands for loyalty, the years of spying, the fear that even a wrongly spoken word could end their line. Yet none dared to openly condemn him. Peter had taught them how easily memory could be rewritten, and how dangerous it was to resist. Even the church bowed. In 1721, 4 years before his death, Peter had abolished the Patriarchate entirely. He replaced the position with a Holy Synod, a state-controlled religious body that turned the church into an obedient arm of the autocracy. The clergy became civil servants, confession became surveillance, and the soul of Russia was placed on a leash. After Peter, no Tsar dared to fully restore the church's independence, because the fear he instilled outlived him. Historians tried to make sense of it. Some painted him as a tragic genius, a man who sacrificed personal happiness, family, and morality for the sake of Russia's survival in a brutal modern world. They called his cruelty necessary. They said he dragged Russia into the 18th century. But others saw something colder. Not a reformer, but a scalpel. Not a leader, but a man who ruled like an autopsy. He dissected his country. He cut out what he deemed sick. And then he stitched the rest back together, with steel thread and shaking hands. What remained was a strange corpse of a nation, part Western, part Orthodox, part military machine, part wounded child, no longer medieval but never fully healed. And Peter's own family, his son Alexei, who died under torture, was never officially rehabilitated during Peter's reign. His body was buried quietly, his name stricken, his bloodline nearly erased. The very crime that should have haunted Peter's memory was buried with him. Even now, Russian schoolchildren learn of Peter the Great, the reformer, the sailor, the builder of navies and cities. Few are told how many corpses paved his road. Fewer still are told that the man died with no heir, no last words, and no mourner, because some truths are too heavy for monuments and too dangerous for memory. So Peter was not forgotten. He was sterilized. The terror was polished into triumph, the violence into vision, the screams into silence. History did not remember him as he was. It remembered what it needed him to be. I have followed this man for 10 chapters now, through palace corridors soaked in blood, through frozen rivers littered with bones, through laughter that ended in execution, through reforms written not in ink, but in agony. And I have to ask myself, was he great or just feared? History calls him Peter the Great, but names are often masks, and his was carved from stone. He built cities, yes. He built fleets, he drafted laws. He opened Russia's door to the West, but he also killed his own son. He mutilated the church. He enslaved peasants by the thousands to construct a monument to himself, one that still stands cold and glittering over the Neva. A statue is not a conscience, and silence is not consent. Peter reshaped Russia. That much is undeniable. But at what cost? He wanted to make his country strong. But he did not make it whole. He modernized its systems, but paralyzed its soul. He gave it tools, ships, maps, but took its breath, its voice, its grief. He was both surgeon and wound, both saviour and executioner, both father and murderer. You may call this complexity. I call it cruelty with a crown. Some say Russia needed him, that the world was too brutal, and only a brutal man could lift it out of medieval darkness. But there is a difference between leading with strength and ruling with terror. There is a difference between vision and vengeance. Peter was not content with breaking walls. He broke people, he broke time. He broke the very idea of inheritance, not just in law, but in love. Because what does it say about a ruler, when even his own son would rather die than become him? And what does it say about us, when we remember the achievements but forget the screams? When we glorify the statues but bury the stories? I do not speak as a historian. I speak as a voice that walks among the forgotten, among the peasants who froze in St. Petersburg, among the monks who hid their icons underground, among the courtiers who bowed with eyes that never rose again, among Alexei, who was not just a prince, but a son, a boy, a soul. We have a strange habit, we humans. We praise the builders of empires, even when they build with bone. We reward ambition even when it devours its own name. We call it greatness when we should call it grief. Peter the Great did not die in battle. He died unfinished, alone, with a sentence half written, like the nation he left behind. And now I ask you, what is the true legacy of a man, if the only thing he could not conquer was kindness in others? And if a father must destroy everything to remake his world, does he leave behind an empire or just a scar?